There are people in this world who feel everything more deeply than they let on. They listen longer, forgive quicker, and carry burdens that were never meant to be theirs. They don't raise their voice when they are hurt. They lower their expectations. They don't announce their pain, they absorb it. These are the empaths. And the tragedy is this: most people don't lose empaths because of one big betrayal, one dramatic argument, or one final explosion. They lose them slowly, quietly, through patterns that feel small but cut deeply. An empath does not disappear because they stop caring. They disappear because caring without being cared for becomes too painful to survive. Today we are confronting a hard truth. There are behaviors that, when directed at an empath long enough, will cause them to vanish from your life without closure, without warning, and without looking back. And when they leave, they don't leave angry. They leave empty. An empath does not wake up one day and decide to leave. What actually happens is far more subtle and far more devastating. It begins when their emotions are repeatedly minimized, dismissed, or misunderstood. When they say something hurts and they are told they are too sensitive. When they express a need and it is labeled as drama. When their emotional reality is questioned instead of honored. Over time, the empath learns a dangerous lesson that their inner world is inconvenient. And because empaths are wired for connection, they don't fight this lesson at first, they adapt to it. They start shrinking their feelings so others can stay comfortable. They begin translating their pain into silence. Chronic emotional invalidation doesn't just hurt an empath's feelings, it fractures their relationship with themselves. Every time their experience is denied, they subconsciously receive the message that their perception of reality cannot be trusted. And when a human being cannot trust their own emotional signals, they begin to disconnect from them. The empath becomes skilled at explaining away their pain, rationalizing neglect, and empathizing with the very people who are harming them. This is not strength, this is survival. At first, the empath tries harder. They choose better words, they soften their tone, they delay their needs, they wait for the right moment that never comes. They believe that if they can just be understood correctly, the invalidation will stop. But invalidation that is chronic is not a communication issue. It is a relational pattern, and patterns teach the nervous system what to expect. An empath's nervous system begins to expect dismissal. It braces itself before speaking. It learns that expression equals rejection. Eventually, the body steps in to protect what the mind keeps sacrificing. This is where self-abandonment begins. The empath stops checking in with themselves and starts scanning others instead. How are they feeling? What do they need? What will keep the peace? This outward focus becomes automatic. And because empaths are highly attuned, they are often praised for this. They are called understanding, patient, emotionally intelligent. What is rarely seen is the cost. The empath is no longer living from authenticity but from adaptation. They are present everywhere except within themselves. Over time, something inside them goes numb. Not because they care less, but because caring has become unsafe. Emotional invalidation tells an empath that vulnerability is a liability, so they close the door quietly. They still show up physically, but emotionally they are retreating. Conversations become shorter, laughter becomes lighter, eye contact becomes less frequent. The connection feels different, but it is hard to name why. This is the disappearing phase. And here is the painful irony. The empath often takes responsibility for this disconnection. They assume they are the problem. They think they are asking for too much, feeling too much, needing too much. So instead of confronting the invalidation, they internalize it. This creates shame, and shame is corrosive to connection. It convinces the empath that their true self is not welcome, and no one can stay where they are not allowed to exist fully. Eventually, the empath reaches a breaking point that looks nothing like a breakdown. It looks like clarity. One moment, something small happens. A dismissive comment, a rolled eye, a familiar tone, and the body recognizes the pattern instantly, not as an isolated incident, but as a lifetime of being unseen. In that moment, the empath does not argue, they do not explain, they simply stop trying. And when an empath stops trying, the bond is already gone. They don't leave to punish. They leave to preserve what is left of themselves. And because they have already grieved the relationship while still in it, their departure feels sudden only to the person who never listened. The empath has been slowly letting go for months, sometimes years, practicing detachment in silence, relearning how to hear their own emotions again, rebuilding trust with their inner world one quiet realization at a time. By the time they walk away, they are not angry, they are resolved. And this is why emotional invalidation is so dangerous with an empath. It doesn't cause explosive conflict, it causes erosion. It teaches them to disappear without making a sound. And once an empath learns that choosing themselves brings peace instead of guilt, they do not return to environments where their emotions must be justified to be respected. Here you go, continuing in the same tone and depth. Taking an empath's empathy without reciprocity slowly drains something vital from them, but it happens in a way that is almost invisible. Empaths are natural givers not because they are weak, but because their nervous system is wired for attunement. They sense shifts in mood, unspoken pain, emotional undercurrents others ignore. When someone is struggling, an empath feels it as if it were their own. In healthy relationships, this gift moves both ways. Care flows back. Support is mutual. But when an empath becomes the emotional supply for someone who rarely gives in return, the relationship becomes parasitic rather than connective. At first, the empath doesn't notice the imbalance. They tell themselves that love means giving more when the other person is depleted. They understand stress, trauma, exhaustion. They justify the lack of reciprocity because they can feel the other person's wounds so clearly. This compassion, however, becomes the very thing that traps them. They start offering reassurance, listening endlessly, holding space, absorbing emotional overflow while their own needs sit quietly in the background unmet and unnamed. The danger here is not generosity itself. The danger is the absence of restoration. When empathy flows in one direction for too long, the empath's internal resources begin to collapse. Emotional energy is not infinite. Even the most compassionate nervous system needs safety, validation, and rest. When those needs are ignored, the body begins to signal distress through fatigue, irritability, anxiety, and eventually emotional shutdown. The empath may not consciously recognize what is happening, but they feel increasingly heavy, drained after interactions that once felt nourishing. The person taking without giving often remains unaware. They grow accustomed to being supported without having to show up emotionally. They may even interpret the empath's giving as proof that everything is fine. After all, the empath is still listening, still helping, still understanding. What they don't see is that the empath is paying for this connection with pieces of themselves. Each one-sided exchange reinforces a silent message: your role here is to hold, not to be held. Over time, the empath begins to feel invisible. Not unseen in a dramatic way, but overlooked in the subtle, daily sense that no one asks how they are doing and truly waits for the answer. Their struggles are acknowledged briefly, then redirected back to someone else's pain. Their exhaustion is met with silence or advice instead of care. They realize that their empathy is expected, not appreciated, and expectation without appreciation turns love into obligation. This dynamic creates a deep internal conflict. Empaths often derive meaning from being helpful, from easing suffering, from showing up emotionally. When they stop receiving in return, they don't immediately stop giving. Instead, they question themselves. They wonder if wanting reciprocity makes them selfish. They minimize their own needs. They double down on giving, hoping that eventually the balance will correct itself. But it rarely does, because relationships that feed on empathy without returning it are built on entitlement, not connection. The body eventually intervenes. Emotional depletion is not just mental, it is physiological. The empath's nervous system becomes overstimulated and undernourished at the same time. They are constantly tuned into others while being disconnected from themselves. This leads to emotional numbness, detachment, and a sense of emptiness that no amount of giving can fill. They may begin to withdraw subtly, responding less, sharing less, offering fewer emotional resources. Not out of spite, but because there is nothing left to give. At this stage, the relationship often feels confusing to the other person. They sense a distance but don't understand its source. They may accuse the empath of changing, becoming cold, or pulling away for no reason. What they fail to see is that the empath is finally listening to their own depletion. This withdrawal is not abandonment, it is self-preservation. When empathy is continually taken without being replenished, the empath learns that staying costs them their well-being. Eventually, something shifts internally. The empath recognizes that love without reciprocity is not love, it is labor. They begin to feel the difference between connection and consumption. This awareness brings grief because it often means acknowledging that the relationship they were sustaining was never truly mutual, and grief creates clarity. The empath stops offering emotional access where there is no emotional safety. They stop pouring into spaces that leave them empty. When an empath disappears because of emotional depletion, they do so quietly. There is no confrontation because they have already explained themselves many times through unmet needs that were ignored. They don't announce their exit because they learned long ago that their feelings were not prioritized. Instead, they reclaim their empathy for themselves. They redirect their energy toward healing, toward relationships that give as much as they take, toward spaces where care flows naturally in both directions. And once an empath experiences what it feels like to be reciprocated, to be emotionally met instead of emotionally mined, they rarely return to environments where their empathy is treated as an unlimited resource rather than a sacred exchange, continuing seamlessly. When disrespect becomes routine, an empath doesn't always recognize it as such at first. Not because they lack self-worth, but because they are trained to look beneath behavior and search for pain, stress, or insecurity. They give people the benefit of the doubt long after the doubt should have expired. A sarcastic comment is excused as a bad day. A boundary crossed is reframed as misunderstanding. A dismissive tone is blamed on pressure or fatigue. Slowly, disrespect stops being an event and starts becoming an atmosphere. And atmospheres shape identity. For an empath, respect is not about formality or politeness. It is about emotional safety. It is about being spoken to with care, being considered, being treated as a human being with an inner world. When disrespect is normalized, the empath absorbs it inward. They do not retaliate. They retreat. They begin to internalize the idea that this is the cost of closeness. That if they want connection, they must tolerate small violations of dignity. And because these violations rarely come with apologies or accountability, They teach the empath something dangerous, that their discomfort does not matter enough to stop the behavior. This is where silent self-erasure begins. The empath starts editing themselves. They stop bringing up concerns because experience has taught them it leads nowhere. They soften their presence so as not to provoke irritation. They speak less, joke more, and become easier to manage, not happier, easier. They learn how to disappear while still being physically present. This adaptation is often mistaken for maturity or patience, but it is actually a nervous system response to repeated disrespect. Disrespect doesn't have to be loud to be damaging. It can live in interruptions, eye rolls, dismissive laughs, chronic lateness, broken promises, or being talked over. These micro-invalidations accumulate. Each one signals to the empath that their time, feelings, or boundaries are secondary. Over time, the empath's sense of self begins to blur. When someone is consistently treated as less important, they begin to feel less real. And no one can maintain intimacy while slowly losing their sense of existence. What makes this particularly harmful is that empaths often try to resolve disrespect through understanding rather than boundaries. They attempt to explain their feelings calmly, gently, repeatedly. But when disrespect is normalized, explanations are ignored, minimized, or reframed as overreactions. This teaches the empath that advocating for themselves creates more distance, not less. So they stop advocating. And when self-advocacy dies, self-erasure takes its place. Inside, the empath feels a growing contradiction. They are deeply sensitive yet increasingly numb. They care intensely yet feel unseen. This tension is exhausting. The mind begins to detach as a form of protection. Emotional investment decreases not because the empath no longer values the relationship, but because continued investment feels like self-betrayal. At some point, staying requires them to keep shrinking. Leaving offers the possibility of expansion. The shift is rarely dramatic. It looks like indifference, but it is actually grief that has settled into acceptance. The empath stops reacting to disrespect because they have stopped expecting respect. And when expectations die, so does connection. What remains is a hollow interaction where one person takes up space and the other has learned how to vanish inside themselves. Eventually, a quiet decision forms. The empath realizes that disappearing internally while staying externally is more painful than leaving altogether. They understand that love should not require the erasure of dignity. And so they begin to step back, not in anger, but in self-respect they are just beginning to reclaim. They reduce contact, they share less. They become unavailable in ways that feel subtle but intentional. To the person who normalized the disrespect, this withdrawal feels sudden and confusing. They may say the empath changed, became distant, stopped caring. What they don't see is that the empath has been disappearing for a long time already. The final physical distance is simply the last stage of a long internal process. When an empath leaves because of normalized disrespect, they do not leave with bitterness. They leave with clarity. They understand that staying would require continued self-erasure, and they have finally learned that connection without respect is not connection at all. Once an empath chooses self-presence over self-erasure, they do not return to environments where their humanity must be negotiated instead of honored. Continuing. Guilt tripping is one of the most effective ways to control an empath because it hijacks the very place where their compassion lives. Empaths are deeply responsive to emotional cues. They feel responsibility easily, not because they are weak, but because they are attuned. When someone uses guilt as a tool, subtly or overtly, it places the empath in a constant state of self-questioning. Every choice becomes loaded. Every boundary feels like harm. Over time, guilt replaces connection and obligation replaces love. At first, guilt tripping doesn't look abusive. It often sounds reasonable, even vulnerable. Phrases like, "After everything I've done for you, I guess I just don't matter to you," or "You've changed," tap directly into the empath's fear of causing pain. The empath doesn't hear manipulation, they hear suffering. And because their instinct is to relieve suffering, they comply. They explain themselves, they overgive, they abandon their needs to restore emotional balance. Each time they do this, guilt is reinforced as a successful strategy. What makes guilt tripping particularly damaging is that it blurs the line between responsibility and control. The empath begins to feel responsible not just for their actions, but for the other person's emotions. If the other person is disappointed, the empath feels at fault. If the other person is upset, the empath searches for what they did wrong. This creates a relational dynamic where the empath is constantly regulating someone else's emotional state while suppressing their own. The relationship stops being a meeting of two nervous systems and becomes a management role. Over time, the empath's inner world becomes saturated with anxiety. They replay conversations, analyze tone, anticipate reactions. They hesitate before speaking or acting, not out of respect, but out of fear of triggering guilt. This hyper-vigilance is exhausting. It teaches the body that authenticity is dangerous and that love must be earned through sacrifice. The empath slowly learns that saying no comes with emotional consequences, so they stop saying it. As guilt tripping continues, the empath's boundaries erode. Boundaries require a sense of self that feels legitimate. Guilt undermines that legitimacy. It whispers that prioritizing oneself is selfish, that rest is neglect, that independence is abandonment. The empath internalizes these messages and begins to police themselves. They preemptively give in even when no one has asked yet. This self-censorship is powerful because it keeps the empath compliant without the need for overt control. Eventually, resentment begins to form, but it is turned inward. The empath feels trapped but blames themselves for feeling that way. They think, if I were more loving, this wouldn't bother me. This internal conflict deepens the disconnect from their own needs. The more they suppress their truth, the more depleted they become. Guilt becomes a constant background noise, shaping their identity and limiting their freedom. There comes a moment, often quiet, when the empath recognizes that the relationship is sustained not by mutual care but by emotional pressure. They notice that their giving is expected, not chosen, that their compliance is praised while their autonomy is punished. This realization can be painful because it reframes what they thought was closeness as control. But it also brings clarity. The empath begins to see that guilt has replaced genuine emotional exchange. When this awareness sets in, the empath starts to pull back internally. They may still show up, but their heart is no longer fully engaged. They conserve energy, they stop over-explaining, they test small acts of autonomy and observe the reaction. If guilt intensifies in response, it confirms what their body already knows. This is not a safe place to be fully human. Eventually, the empath reaches a threshold where the cost of staying outweighs the fear of leaving. They understand that living under constant guilt is not love, it is emotional captivity. And because empaths value inner integrity deeply, they cannot remain in relationships that require them to betray themselves to keep someone else comfortable. When an empath disappears after prolonged guilt tripping, it often shocks the person who relied on that guilt. They may accuse the empath of becoming selfish or cold. But what has actually happened is that the empath has stepped out of emotional control and back into self-ownership. They leave quietly because they know any explanation will be met with more guilt. Silence becomes the only boundary that finally holds. And once an empath experiences relationships where care is offered freely, without emotional debt or obligation, they no longer tolerate dynamics where guilt is the currency of connection. Continuing. Emotional neglect is one of the most misunderstood forms of harm, especially when it comes to empaths, because it leaves no visible bruises and creates no obvious conflict. Nothing dramatic happens, no shouting, no explosions, just absence. And for an empath, absence is not neutral, it is deafening. Empaths are attuned to emotional presence, the warmth of attention, the feeling of being considered, the sense that their inner world matters to someone else. When that presence is missing, their nervous system registers it as threat, even if everything looks calm on the surface. Unlike abuse, which creates a clear signal that something is wrong, emotional neglect creates confusion. The empath keeps asking themselves whether they are imagining it. After all, no one is actively hurting them. They are not being insulted or controlled, they are simply not being met. Conversations stay shallow. Emotional bids go unanswered. Joy is not mirrored. Pain is acknowledged briefly, then forgotten. The empath feels alone in the relationship, but struggles to name why, and this lack of clarity can be more destabilizing than overt harm. Empaths tend to respond to emotional neglect by increasing effort. They share more vulnerably, hoping it will invite closeness. They initiate connection, check in frequently, offer depth and presence. When these attempts are met with distraction, detachment, or emotional unavailability, the empath doesn't immediately withdraw. They assume the other person is tired, stressed, overwhelmed. They make excuses because they can feel the other person's limitations. What they don't realize at first is that empathy cannot replace engagement. One person cannot carry intimacy alone. Over time, emotional neglect communicates a painful message: your inner life is not a priority here. For an empath whose sense of connection is rooted in emotional exchange, this message cuts deeply. They begin to feel unseen, not because they are hidden, but because no one is looking. They start questioning their worth, their desirability, their emotional legitimacy. This self-doubt grows quietly, feeding on the silence where care should be. The body responds to neglect differently than it responds to abuse. Abuse triggers fight or flight. Neglect triggers collapse. The empath's energy drops, motivation fades. Emotional expression becomes risky because it consistently goes nowhere. Eventually, the empath learns that sharing leads to disappointment, so they stop sharing, not as punishment but as protection. Hope becomes too painful to sustain when it is repeatedly unmet. What makes emotional neglect particularly devastating for empaths is that they can often feel the potential for connection that is never realized. They sense what could be, what might exist if the other person were present. This makes the absence feel personal, as if the empath is the reason the connection doesn't deepen. They internalize the neglect and turn it into self-blame. Maybe I'm too much, maybe I'm boring, maybe I ask for too much closeness. This internalization keeps them stuck longer than they should be. As neglect continues, the empath begins to grieve a relationship that still technically exists. They sit next to someone and feel alone. They share space but not intimacy. This kind of loneliness is especially painful because it happens in proximity. There is no clear ending, no justification for leaving that feels solid enough. And yet, staying requires the empath to numb themselves to survive. They reduce expectations, they lower emotional needs. They make themselves smaller so the absence hurts less. Eventually, numbness sets in. Not peace numbness. The empath stops reaching out emotionally because the cost outweighs the reward. Their eyes stop searching for attunement. Their voice carries less warmth. They begin to feel disconnected not only from the other person but from themselves. Emotional neglect slowly erodes vitality. It drains color from the world. And because this erosion is gradual, it is often mistaken for depression or burnout, rather than recognized as a relational injury. There comes a moment when the empath realizes that the quiet ache they feel is not temporary, that the emotional absence is not a phase, that they are waiting for something that may never arrive. This realization is painful, but also grounding. It allows the empath to name what has been happening without minimizing it. They understand that love without presence is not nourishment, it is deprivation. When an empath leaves an emotionally neglectful relationship, they often struggle to explain why. There was no single event to point to, no obvious wrongdoing, just a slow withering. To outsiders, the departure may seem unnecessary or confusing, but for the empath, leaving is an act of self-rescue. They are choosing aliveness over numbness. They are choosing environments where their emotions are met, not merely tolerated. Emotional neglect teaches an empath that they can survive without being seen, but it also teaches them how much it costs. And once an empath reconnects with relationships that offer genuine presence, curiosity, and emotional engagement, the contrast becomes undeniable. They realize that what they endured was not neutrality but absence, and absence is something the empathic nervous system can no longer endure without disappearing from itself continuing. When an empath is made responsible for someone else's emotions, the burden doesn't arrive all at once. It accumulates slowly, disguised as care, concern, or closeness. At first it feels like trust. The other person confides deeply, leans heavily, shares distress, and the empath responds naturally, listening, soothing, regulating. Empaths are skilled at this because their nervous systems are highly responsive. They can sense shifts, calm tension, and create emotional safety. But when this role becomes permanent, when the empath is expected to absorb, manage, and fix another person's emotional world, their own system begins to collapse under the weight. This dynamic often starts with subtle cues. The other person's mood dictates the atmosphere. If they are upset, the empath feels pressure to make it better. If they are anxious, the empath feels compelled to reassure. If they are angry, the empath walks on eggshells. Over time, the empath learns that emotional equilibrium in the relationship depends on their performance. They become the stabilizer, the translator, the emotional anchor. And while this may be framed as closeness, it is actually emotional outsourcing. The empath's nervous system is not designed to carry two emotional loads at once. Constantly tracking someone else's feelings while suppressing their own creates chronic overstimulation. The body stays in a heightened state of alert, scanning for emotional shifts, anticipating reactions, preparing responses. This hyper-responsibility leads to exhaustion that sleep does not fix. The empath may feel wired and tired at the same time, unable to relax fully even when alone. As this pattern continues, the empath's own emotions become inconvenient. There is no space for their sadness, frustration, or fear because the relationship is already saturated with someone else's inner world. When they do attempt to express their feelings, they may be met with defensiveness, withdrawal, or guilt-inducing responses. This reinforces the belief that their emotions are a problem rather than a shared experience, so they begin to suppress them. Emotional suppression, however, does not eliminate feelings, it stores them in the body. The longer an empath is placed in the role of emotional caretaker, the more their nervous system shifts from connection to survival. They stop experiencing interactions as mutual exchanges and start experiencing them as demands. Even neutral conversations feel heavy because the empath is bracing for emotional labor. This chronic strain can manifest as anxiety, irritability, dissociation, or a sense of being emotionally trapped. The empath may fantasize about escape not because they don't care, but because their system needs relief. What is particularly damaging is that this dynamic often comes with moral pressure. The empath is told, directly or indirectly, that if they cared enough, they would continue to show up emotionally. That leaving would be abandonment. That setting boundaries would cause harm. This places the empath in an impossible position. Sacrifice themselves or be seen as cruel. For someone whose identity is tied to compassion, this internal conflict is devastating. Eventually, the empath begins to feel resentful, but again the resentment is turned inward. They blame themselves for feeling overwhelmed. They think they should be able to handle this. They judge their own limits. This self-judgment further dysregulates the nervous system, deepening the cycle of burnout. The empath becomes emotionally brittle, easily overwhelmed, and disconnected from joy. Everything feels like effort. There comes a moment when the body can no longer sustain this level of responsibility. The empath may experience a shutdown, a sudden emotional numbness or detachment that feels alarming but is actually protective. This is the nervous system's last resort. When fight or flight are not possible, the system chooses collapse. The empath stops engaging emotionally not because they don't care, but because caring has become physiologically unsafe. This shutdown is often misinterpreted by others as coldness or indifference. In reality, it is a sign of profound overload. The empath has been carrying too much for too long, and once this shutdown occurs, it is very difficult to reverse without significant change in the relational dynamic. The body remembers what it cost to stay open, When an empath disappears after being made responsible for someone else's emotions, it often happens abruptly. One day they simply stop responding the same way. They create distance. They become unavailable. To the other person, it feels sudden and unfair. But for the empath, the leaving has been a long time coming. Their nervous system has been asking for relief for months, sometimes years. Walking away becomes an act of regulation. Distance allows their system to finally settle. They can breathe again. They can feel their own emotions without immediately needing to manage someone else's. And once an empath experiences the calm that comes from no longer carrying emotional weight that was never theirs to bear, they do not willingly return to relationships that require self-sacrifice as the price of connection. Continuing, when an empath sets a boundary, it is rarely impulsive or harsh. It usually comes after long periods of discomfort, reflection, and internal negotiation. Empaths don't enjoy limits because limits feel like separation and separation feels like loss. So when they finally say no, ask for space, or express a need for change, it is a vulnerable act. It is an attempt to preserve connection without losing themselves. But when those boundaries are dismissed, mocked, ignored, or challenged, the message received is clear: your limits are not respected here. Boundary dismissal teaches an empath something powerful and painful. It teaches them that their needs are negotiable, but other people's comfort is not. When a boundary is treated as unreasonable or selfish, the empath begins to associate self-protection with guilt and conflict. This creates an internal split. One part of them knows the boundary is necessary for their well-being. Another part fears that enforcing it will result in rejection, withdrawal, or punishment. Over time, to avoid this pain, the empath stops asserting boundaries altogether. Instead of saying no, they withdraw energetically. Instead of asking for space, they create distance silently. Instead of explaining what they need, they disappear emotionally. This is not passive aggression. It is a learned response. When direct communication repeatedly leads to invalidation, the nervous system adapts by choosing invisibility over confrontation. The empath learns that being unseen feels safer than being challenged for having limits. Repeated boundary violations also erode trust at a deep level. Trust is not just about honesty, it is about predictability and respect. When an empath says, "This hurts," and the behavior continues, the body learns that words are not honored. When they say, "I need space," and that space is invaded, the body learns that safety is conditional. Eventually, the empath stops trusting the relationship to hold their truth, and without trust, intimacy cannot survive. This dynamic creates emotional fatigue that is difficult to articulate. The empath feels constantly on guard, anticipating the next violation, bracing for the next dismissal. They may begin to feel trapped even if no one is physically restraining them. Their autonomy feels compromised, and because empaths are deeply relational, this loss of autonomy feels like a loss of self. They are present, but not free. What often goes unnoticed is that each ignored boundary pushes the empath further inward. They stop sharing their internal world because it doesn't feel protected. They reduce vulnerability. They become harder to read. This withdrawal is gradual, almost imperceptible. The relationship still exists, but it is hollowed out. The empath is there in body, but not in spirit. At some point, the empath realizes that maintaining the relationship requires constant self-monitoring. They must stay flexible while the other remains fixed. They must adapt while the other resists change. This imbalance becomes unbearable. Boundaries are not walls, they are bridges that show where connection can safely occur. When those bridges are repeatedly trampled, the empath stops rebuilding them. There is usually one moment, a seemingly small incident, when the empath recognizes that their boundaries will never be honored here. It might be a joke made at their expense after they asked for sensitivity, a demand placed on them after they expressed exhaustion, a repeated behavior they clearly said they could not tolerate. In that moment, something clicks. Not anger, but certainty. The body understands what the mind has been trying to avoid. From that point on, the empath no longer explains. Explanation feels pointless. They conserve energy. They begin to disengage quietly without drama. This is where disappearance begins, not out of cruelty, but out of clarity. The empath understands that the only boundary that will be respected is distance. To the person who ignored the boundaries, this withdrawal feels confusing. They may say the empath never spoke up, never said anything clearly enough, but boundaries were expressed. They were just not taken seriously. And when boundaries are consistently dismissed, silence becomes the final form of self-protection. When an empath disappears after their boundaries have been repeatedly violated, they are not avoiding connection. They are choosing safety. They are choosing environments where their limits are met with respect rather than resistance. And once an empath experiences the relief of being in spaces where no explanation is required for self-care, they no longer stay where disappearing feels like the only way to remain intact. Continuing, lack of accountability fractures emotional safety in ways that are especially damaging for an empath. Empaths rely on repair. They understand that humans make mistakes, say the wrong thing, act from wounds. What they need is not perfection, but acknowledgement. When harm is named and met with accountability, the empath's nervous system can relax. It knows the relationship can heal. But when mistakes are denied, minimized, justified, or turned back on the empath, something essential breaks. The space no longer feels safe for truth. Accountability is not about blame, it is about reality. It is the willingness to say, I see how that affected you. Without it, the empath is left alone with the impact of the behavior while the other person protects their self-image. This creates an imbalance where the empath carries both the pain and the responsibility to move on. They are expected to forgive without repair, to understand without being understood. Over time, this becomes emotionally unsustainable. When accountability is absent, conversations about harm follow a predictable pattern. The empath shares their experience carefully, often softening their words to avoid conflict. The response, however, deflects. That's not what I meant. You're taking it too personally. You're remembering it wrong. Or the focus shifts to intent rather than impact. This leaves the empath doubting their perception, not because they are fragile, but because repeated denial of reality destabilizes the nervous system. When truth is contested, safety disappears. This dynamic forces the empath into a painful role: either suppress their experience or escalate it to be taken seriously. Neither option feels safe. Suppression leads to resentment and self-betrayal. Escalation risks being labeled dramatic or aggressive. So the empath often chooses silence. They stop bringing things up, they stop expecting repair. And when repair is no longer expected, connection begins to die. Lack of accountability also erodes trust in subtle ways. Trust depends on the belief that if something goes wrong, it can be addressed honestly. When accountability is consistently avoided, the empath learns that there is no point in speaking up. The relationship becomes fragile, held together by avoidance rather than authenticity. The empath starts monitoring themselves instead of trusting the bond. This self-monitoring creates emotional distance. Inside, the empath experiences a quiet grief. They are not grieving a single incident, but the loss of mutuality. They realize that their emotional reality does not carry equal weight, that their pain is negotiable, but the other person's comfort is not. This realization changes how they show up. Vulnerability feels dangerous, openness feels naive. The empath begins to protect themselves by limiting emotional exposure. As time passes, unresolved harm accumulates. Each unacknowledged moment stacks on top of the last, creating a heavy emotional ledger. The empath feels burdened by memories that were never addressed, apologies that never came, conversations that went nowhere. This weight makes presence difficult. Joy becomes muted. Engagement feels forced. The relationship loses its vitality because it lacks the oxygen of honesty. Eventually, the empath reaches a conclusion that is less emotional than it is logical. If there is no accountability, there is no repair. If there is no repair, there is no safety. But without safety, the nervous system cannot remain open. This clarity does not come with rage, it comes with resignation. The empath understands that staying means continuously reopening wounds that will never be tended to. When an empath disappears due to lack of accountability, they often do so without explanation. Not because they cannot articulate what happened, but because they have learned that explanation changes nothing. They have already tried. They have already spoken. Silence becomes the final acknowledgement of a truth that was never met. From the outside, this departure can look abrupt or unfair. But internally, the empath has been disengaging for a long time. They have been closing doors one unacknowledged hurt at a time. When they finally leave, it is not an impulsive act, it is the result of repeated attempts at repair that were met with deflection instead of responsibility. And once an empath experiences relationships where accountability is natural, where harm is named and addressed without ego, they do not return to spaces where emotional safety depends on their willingness to endure what will never be owned.